Montana Territory, 1887. The town of Willow Creek sat nestled between rolling plains and distant mountains, a place where the untamed West met civilization's tentative grasp. Dust swirled through the main street as Thomas Tucker dismounted from his weary horse, his lean frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. At 25, Thomas still possessed the restlessness that had driven him away 3 years prior. A restlessness born from the belief that a man couldn't survive the frontier with his heart tied to one place or one person. A cowboy belongs to the open range, he whispered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated whenever memories of Willow Creek, and of her, threatened to soften his resolve. His hazel eyes, weathered at their corners from squinting against prairie suns, scanned the familiar buildings with unease. Thomas had spent years convincing himself that attachment was the enemy of survival out west. A man alone could move quick, make hard decisions, and never look back. His worn boots left prints in the mud as he led his horse toward the livery. The town had grown some, but not enough to make it unfamiliar. 3 years of driving cattle across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas had hardened his hands and thinned his face. But at his core, he remained the same conflicted young man who'd ridden out with promises on his lips he hadn't intended to keep. As children darted between buildings and shopkeepers arranged their wares, Thomas felt the weight of being an outsider in the place he once called home. What he wanted was simple: to check on his ailing father, settle his affairs, and return to the freedom of the open range. What he needed, belonging, forgiveness, love, remained unacknowledged, buried beneath layers of frontier-hardened pride. At the end of the street stood Olsen's general store, and Thomas's heart quickened despite himself. Would she still be there? Had she waited as he'd asked her to? Or had she wisely moved on with her life? Thomas Tucker, as I live and breathe. The voice belonged to Elijah Burnett, the town's barber and longtime friend of Thomas's father. Mr. Burnett, Thomas nodded, tipping his hat. My father? How is he? Better than last month. Doc Miller got that fever under control. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. She still works at her father's store, if that's what you're wondering next. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. I wasn't, son, in a town this size. Everybody knows everybody's business. And everybody remembers promises made. The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. 3 years ago, he'd stood on the boarding platform of Olsen's general store, holding the hands of Pearl Olsen as she wept. She'd been 19 then, with honey blonde hair and eyes the color of summer sky. I'll be back in 6 months, he'd promised. We'll get married like we planned. I just need to make my fortune first. That promise lay between them now, forgotten by him, but apparently remembered by everyone else in Willow Creek. Thomas was about to respond when he saw her. Pearl Olsen, now 22, stepped onto the porch of her father's store. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical style that still managed to frame her face beautifully. She was arranging items in the window display, unaware of his presence. Their eyes met across the distance, and the busy street seemed to fall silent around them. For a moment, neither moved. Then Pearl dropped the tin she'd been holding and disappeared back into the store. Well, Elijah said with a sigh, can't say I blame her. The incident catalyzed Thomas's next days in Willow Creek. He settled into his father's modest home, relieved to find the older Tucker recovering well from his illness. But the town felt different, or perhaps Thomas himself had changed. Every corner held memories of Pearl, of promises spoken in earnest and broken through neglect. On his third evening back, Thomas found himself outside the Olsen's home behind the general store, hat in hand. Pearl's father answered the door, his expression unreadable. Mr. Olsen, I'd like to speak with Pearl, if I may. The older man studied him. She's helping Mrs. Foster with her new baby. Due back shortly. He hesitated, then opened the door wider. You might as well wait inside. Thomas sat uncomfortably in the Olsen's neat parlor, surrounded by the domesticity he'd convinced himself he couldn't want. Mr. Olsen offered him coffee, but little conversation. When the front door finally opened, Thomas rose to his feet. Pearl stopped in the doorway, her expression guarded. Thomas. Pearl. He faltered, suddenly unsure what to say. I'll leave you two to talk, Mr. Olsen said, disappearing into the kitchen. Pearl remained standing. 3 years, Thomas. Not 6 months. I know. No letters after the first year. The cattle drives took me further north than I expected. Stop. Her voice was soft but firm. I don't want excuses. What are you doing here? Thomas swallowed hard. My father was sick. I came to see him. And now you're leaving again. It wasn't a question. Thomas should have agreed. He should have confirmed her assumption and walked away, preserving his belief that the frontier was no place for lasting attachments. Instead, he found himself saying, I don't know. The honesty in his voice seemed to catch her off guard. For the first time, Pearl really looked at him. You've changed. Not enough, probably, he admitted. Pearl, I didn't come here expecting anything from you. I broke my promise. I know that. Yes, you did. She finally moved fully into the room, setting down her shawl. But I made a promise to, Thomas. I promised to wait. I never expected you to keep it after I. That was your mistake, she interrupted. Thinking promises only matter when they're convenient. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sheriff Anderson entered looking grim, nodding briefly to them both. Sorry to intrude, Mr. Olsen, he called toward the kitchen. Thomas, I thought you should know, Wade Garrison's in town. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Garrison? Are you sure? Checked into the hotel an hour ago. Claims he's just passing through, but I thought you should know. After the sheriff left, Pearl studied Thomas's face. Who is Wade Garrison? Thomas hesitated. 2 years ago, I was working a cattle drive for a rancher named Garrison. His brother Wade was foreman. He paused. Wade was stealing cattle, selling them across the territory line. I caught him, reported him to the rancher. And Wade got fired, swore he'd find me someday. Last I heard, he was running with a rough gang out of Wyoming. Pearl's expression changed to concern. You should tell the sheriff everything. I will. Thomas looked at her earnestly. Pearl, I know I have no right to ask, but could we talk again? Tomorrow? Something in his vulnerability must have reached her, because she nodded. The creek, where we used to meet. Noon. The following days transformed Thomas's plan to leave Willow Creek quickly. Each afternoon, he and Pearl walked along the creek or sat beneath the old cottonwood tree where they'd once carved their initials. She told him of the past 3 years, her teaching at the small schoolhouse 2 days a week, the growth of her father's store, the marriages and births in town. He shared stories of the cattle drives, the vastness of the territories, the stars over unfamiliar landscapes. Why did you really leave, Thomas? Pearl asked one afternoon as they sat watching the creek's waters ripple over stones. The truth this time. Thomas stared at his hands. My father had just lost the ranch. I felt useless, like I couldn't provide for anyone, especially not a wife. I convinced myself I was doing right by you, leaving to make my fortune. And did you? Make your fortune? He laughed softly. Hardly. Made enough to live, to send some home to my father. But mostly, I think I was running. From what? From feeling like I wasn't enough. The admission cost him, but once spoken, the words seemed to release something tight within his chest. Out there, being alone made sense. Being responsible only for myself meant I couldn't fail anyone else. Pearl reached for his hand. Thomas Tucker, you're the only one who ever thought you weren't enough. Their reconnection progressed cautiously, Pearl's initial wariness gradually softening as Thomas demonstrated day after day that he wasn't leaving. He found work at the livery, using his horsemanship skills to help break the wild mustangs brought in from the hills. He repaired his father's small house, joined the men at church on Sundays, and slowly reclaimed his place in the community. But Wade Garrison's presence cast a shadow over Thomas's growing hope. The man lingered in town, watching Thomas from a distance, occasionally making pointed remarks within earshot. Sheriff Anderson kept an eye on him, but could do nothing without cause. He's waiting for something, Thomas told Pearl one evening as he walked her home. I can feel it. For what? I don't know, but I need to be ready. Their cautious courtship bloomed despite the threat. With each passing day, Thomas found his old belief that attachment was weakness, challenged by the strength he drew from Pearl's presence. When he was with her, the world made more sense. The frontier seemed less harsh, the future less uncertain. One evening, 6 weeks after Thomas's return, they attended the town's harvest dance together. Pearl wore a dress of deep green that made her eyes even bluer, her blonde hair arranged with small white flowers. As Thomas twirled her around the dance floor of the community hall, he realized he was genuinely happy for the first time in years. I love you, Pearl, he said quietly as they stepped outside for air. I never stopped. She studied his face in the lantern light. I want to believe that. It's true. Everything I did, leaving, staying away, it was because I didn't think I deserved you. I still don't. But I've learned enough to know that sometimes life gives you gifts you haven't earned. Pearl touched his face gently. Thomas Tucker, when will you understand? Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing every day. Their kiss, gentle and full of promise, marked a turning point. Thomas finally allowed himself to imagine a future in Willow Creek, with Pearl, with a family, with roots that sustained rather than constrained. The following morning, everything changed. Thomas arrived at the livery to find the door ajar, the interior dark and silent. As he stepped inside, pain exploded at the back of his head, and the world went black. He awoke bound to a chair in an abandoned cabin outside town. Wade Garrison stood before him, flanked by two rough-looking men. Finally awake, Tucker? Garrison's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. Been planning this a long time. The sheriff will? Sheriff won't do nothing. Far as anyone knows, you lit out of town again. Left your sweetheart high and dry a second time. Thomas's blood ran cold. What did you do to Pearl? Nothing. Yet. Garrison circled him slowly. But she's part of the plan. See, you cost me more than a job, Tucker. You cost me my reputation. Couldn't get hired anywhere decent after you opened your mouth. You were stealing. A backhanded slap silenced him. I'm going to take everything from you. Your girl. Your town's respect. Then, maybe, I'll let you die. Garrison and his men left Thomas alone, bound and bleeding. Through the cabin's dirty window, he could see the sun setting. Pearl would be wondering where he was. Would she believe he'd abandon her again? The thought was more painful than his physical injuries. Hours passed. Thomas worked desperately at his bonds, memories of Pearl giving him strength. Their conversations along the creek echoed in his mind. Her belief in him, her forgiveness, her love, all were at risk if he couldn't escape. Near midnight, Thomas managed to work one hand free, then the other. Moving silently, he eased the cabin door open and slipped into the darkness. He had to get back to town, to Pearl, before Garrison could implement whatever he had planned. The 5-mile journey took hours in his weakened state. As dawn broke, Thomas staggered into Willow Creek to find commotion at the general store. A crowd had gathered, and at its center stood Sheriff Anderson and Pearl's father. What's happened? Thomas pushed through, ignoring the gasps at his bloodied appearance. Thomas. Mr. Olsen grabbed his shoulders. Where have you been? They've taken Pearl. The world seemed to tilt beneath Thomas's feet. Garrison. It's Garrison. Sheriff Anderson approached quickly. What do you know about this, Tucker? Thomas explained everything. Wade's grudge, the kidnapping, the threats. He wants revenge on me. Pearl is just a way to hurt me. We found this, the sheriff said, handing Thomas a note. The message was clear. Thomas was to come alone to Eagle Canyon with all the money he could gather if he wanted to see Pearl alive again. I'm going after her, Thomas declared. Not alone, the sheriff countered. I'm assembling men, no. He'll kill her if he sees a posse. Thomas straightened despite his pain. I have to do this my way. Son, that's suicide, Mr. Olsen protested. Thomas looked at the older man steadily. Sir, I broke my promise to Pearl once. I won't fail her again, not when it matters most. Against the objections of both men, Thomas gathered supplies. His father provided the small stash of money he'd been saving, and Thomas took the fastest horse from the livery. Before leaving, he wrote a letter and gave it to his father, to be delivered to Pearl if he didn't return. Eagle Canyon lay 2 hours' ride from town, a rocky defile perfect for ambush. As Thomas approached, he tied his horse out of sight and proceeded on foot. He wasn't going to play by Garrison's rules, not when Pearl's life was at stake. Using skills honed from years on the frontier, Thomas circled the canyon, spotting Garrison's lookout before the man saw him. Silently, Thomas overpowered him, tying him securely to a tree. One down, at least 2 to go. In the canyon below, he could see Pearl tied to a post near a small campfire. Garrison paced nearby while his remaining henchman cleaned a rifle. Pearl's face was bruised, but her posture remained defiant. Pride and fear warred in Thomas's heart at the sight. Thomas created a diversion by startling the horses tethered nearby. As the animals bolted, Garrison cursed and sent his man to retrieve them. With the odds momentarily even, Thomas slid down into the canyon, gun drawn. "Let her go, Garrison." His voice echoed off the canyon walls. Wade spun, drawing his pistol. "Tucker, should have known you'd ignore instructions. This is between you and me. Pearl has nothing to do with it." Garrison laughed. "She has everything to do with it. She's what you care about most." He moved closer to Pearl, pressing his gun against her temple. "Drop your weapon." Thomas hesitated, then slowly placed his gun on the ground. "Thomas, don't," Pearl began, but Garrison silenced her with a rough shake. "Now the money," Garrison demanded. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out the small bag of coins. "It's all I have." "Pathetic," Garrison sneered. "Throw it here." Thomas complied, his mind racing. The moment the bag hit Garrison's feet, Thomas charged forward. Garrison fired, the bullet grazing Thomas's shoulder, but momentum carried Thomas into the larger man, knocking them both to the ground. They struggled fiercely, Garrison's greater weight giving him advantage until Pearl, who had worked her hands free, struck him from behind with a fallen branch. The momentary distraction allowed Thomas to gain the upper hand, subduing Garrison with a series of punches. "Thomas!" Pearl's warning came just as the second outlaw returned, rifle raised. Thomas dove for his discarded pistol, firing from the ground. The outlaw fell. In the sudden silence, Thomas rushed to Pearl, cutting her remaining bonds with his knife. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, examining her face. "I'll live," she assured him, then looked over his shoulder with alarm. "Thomas!" He turned to see Garrison rising, knife in hand. Before either could react, a shot rang out. Garrison collapsed, revealing Sheriff Anderson standing at the canyon entrance, rifle smoking. "Figured you could use some backup," the sheriff said, approaching with 2 deputies. Followed at a distance. The ride back to Willow Creek was slow, Pearl seated before Thomas on his horse, his arms around her waist, as if he'd never let go. They spoke little, the shared trauma and relief needing time to settle. That evening, after Pearl had been examined by the doctor and Thomas's wounds dressed, they sat together on the porch of the Olsen home. "I thought you'd left again," Pearl admitted quietly. "When you didn't show up, for one terrible moment, I thought history was repeating itself." Thomas took her hand. "I wouldn't have blamed you for thinking it. But Pearl, I've learned something important. All those years I spent believing the frontier was no place for attachment, that caring for someone was a weakness, I was wrong. Today proved it." "How so?" she asked. "If I hadn't cared about you, if I hadn't loved you, I wouldn't have found the strength to escape, to fight. Love didn't make me vulnerable. It made me stronger than I've ever been." Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "I knew that all along, Thomas. I was just waiting for you to discover it." Thomas knelt before her in the golden light of sunset. "Pearl Olsen, 3 years ago, I made you a promise I failed to keep. I'm making a new one now. I promise to love you every day of my life, to build a home with you right here in Willow Creek, to never again mistake running for freedom." He pulled a small ring from his pocket, his mother's, given to him by his father that morning. "Will you marry me?" Pearl's smile was radiant through her tears. "Yes, Thomas Tucker, I will." They married 2 weeks later in the small church of Willow Creek. Thomas's father stood proudly beside him, and Pearl, in a dress of ivory silk with wildflowers in her hair, was a vision of frontier beauty. The entire town attended, bearing witness to the fulfillment of a long-delayed promise. With money from the reward for Garrison's capture and loan from Pearl's father, they purchased land on the edge of town, not as vast as the ranch Thomas's family had lost, but good land with promise. Together they built a modest home, adding rooms as their needs grew. 5 years later, Thomas stood on the porch of that home, watching Pearl in the garden with their 3-year-old son and infant daughter. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, Thomas's knowledge of horses combining with Pearl's business sense learned at her father's store. "Papa!" His son ran to him, arms outstretched, and Thomas lifted him high. Pearl approached with their daughter cradled against her shoulder, her blue eyes still as bright as the day Thomas had returned to Willow Creek. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, noting his expression. Thomas smiled, putting his free arm around her waist. "Just grateful. For this life. For you waiting, even when I didn't deserve it." Pearl leaned against him. "I always knew you'd come back, Thomas. Some promises are written in the heart, not just spoken with words." As the sun set over their land, casting long shadows across the flowering fields, Thomas Tucker finally understood the truth he'd once been too afraid to accept. The real frontier wasn't the wild landscape or untamed territories. The real frontier was this: having the courage to build something lasting in a world of uncertainty, to love without reservation despite life's hardships, to make promises and keep them against all odds. In Pearl's arms and in the home they'd built together, Thomas had found not the constraints he once feared, but the truest freedom he'd ever known.